against Iran. Let's get... Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. What did the U.S. and Israel achieve with their 12-day war against Iran? Let's get to the bottom line. After bombing each other for 12 days, including an attack by the United States on Iranian nuclear sites and a telegraphed Iranian response, a ceasefire was announced by President Donald Trump. All three sides claimed victory, and celebrations were held in Tehran's Revolution Square as Tel Aviv went back to normal life. When Israel attacked Iran, Israeli and American leaders were talking about ending Iran's nuclear program and maybe even regime change in Tehran. Neither of those things happened, and now Trump is talking about resuming dialogue with Iran. So what was achieved in this war? What changes now for Iran, for the United States, and for Israel? And what impact will it have on the wider region, including on Gaza? Today we're talking with Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and he's author of several books on the geopolitics of the Middle East, including Treacherous Alliance, the secret dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States. Trita, thanks so much for joining us. Look, I'm trying to now just take stock of what happened in what Donald Trump is calling the 12-day war. Many of his critics in the MAGA world, Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson, and others, were convinced this was going to trigger yet another forever war, that America was going in the direction that Donald Trump had campaigned against, that all of a sudden we're in a hot war directly with Iran. 12 days later, it's closed. Are you surprised as I am?
I am surprised, but in the past we have seen that as much as I was against the decision to do this, I think in many ways, in the long run, this is going to make matters worse. There is a nimbleness that Trump has. He is not path dependent. He can make decisions and change his course 180 degrees without regret, without much consideration. And as a result of that ability, which is also part of the reason why he went into Yemen, another mistake, but then within 30 days he pulled out, declared victory, even though nothing had been achieved. But imagine other presidents. They would have continued, even though they knew very well nothing would be gained. They wouldn't have to, they didn't want to deal with the political cost of having to pull out. So they would have just kicked the can down the road and hope that the next president would deal with it. And after a couple of presidents, you're sitting there with a 20-year endless war. Trump didn't do that. He should have gone in, but he pulled out, and I think that's good. And in this case as well, I'm not so sure the original plan was just to do one-off. It may have been, but I think it nevertheless came at a huge risk. And we saw that when the Israelis took the first possible opportunity to break the ceasefire, and Trump did something that I think is completely unprecedented, dropped the F-bomb on the Israelis, and tweeted that they have to return their airplanes back to Israel, and stopped the Israelis restarting the war. Which shows, again, if he could do it, he can also do it in Gaza. We can end that genocide if Trump decides to put down his foot. What is critical in all of this, though, is whether he will sustain that no in the manner that is needed. We have seen him tell the Israelis no. There would not have been a first ceasefire had it not been for Trump. But he didn't keep the pressure up, and as a result, Netanyahu quickly managed to find a way out of it, and we never reached phase 2. The administration thought we were certainly reached phase 2. They were more skeptical about phase 3. We never even got to phase 2, and it's because at the end of the day, you can't just say no once, you have to sustain it. And he's going to have to do the same thing here in order to make sure that this ceasefire lasts.
I want to play a clip for you on the president's comments on Gaza. Let's listen.
I think great progress is being made on Gaza. I think because of this attack that we made, I think we're going to have some very good news. I was talking to Steve Witkoff, who, by the way, is terrific. So he's really very knowledgeable. But he did tell me that Gaza is very close.
So, Trita, here's the president on kind of a victory lap. He's in NATO, where he's been celebrated for encouraging nations to get their defense spending up. He's coming off the 12-day war in which he's gotten both sides to kick back. And he's saying, hey, hold on, we may have some good news in Gaza. Is this equation adding up for you?
I'm not really sure. Now, there is an element in which perhaps the Iranians have agreed to do something on the Gaza front. But to be completely frank, what has held up any agreement in the past is not because Hamas was not willing to release the hostages or because they were playing for time or anything like that. It's over and over again been because of the fact that at the end of the day, Netanyahu does not want to end that war. And he would never commit that even the release of all hostages would lead to the end of the war. Now, what the Iranians can do about that, it really, baffles me. So I'm a little bit surprised by this. But I will go back to what I said earlier on. If Trump is confident that something can happen in Gaza, perhaps he had put down the foot with the Israelis and told them enough is enough. That would be great news, but for that to be a long-term solution or lead to a long-term ceasefire, he needs to keep that foot down. He needs to sustain that pressure. Because Netanyahu has proven himself to be absolutely masterful in finding loopholes and restarting the war and trying to trap Trump in positions in which he cannot pressure Israel.
But one of the other dimensions of this conflict, really the post-conflict, has been the administration's insistence that it obliterated Iran's nuclear program, that there is nothing left. And it's so destroyed that there's not even a need for nuclear negotiations any longer. There may be a talk about other issues, according to President Trump, but not nuclear issues. It feels a little bit to me like George W. Bush on the ship with the big mission accomplished sign behind him. How does it feel to you?
I understand that imagery. I think there's one important difference. The administration is saying this because they don't want to go back in. They're under tremendous pressure from the Israelis to restart the war. The Israelis were going to the president saying everything is not finished. And the president, and I think the people around him perhaps even more so, understood that even if he went back in, and even if the program was eliminated in the second round, the Israelis would after that come back and say, but hold on, you didn't take out the missiles. And even if he did that, the Israelis would come back and say, but hold on, what about their conventional military capabilities? And even if he did that, they would come back and say, yeah, but they still have these proxies in Iraq and elsewhere. It was a realization that this was just going to be an endless stream of demands. And as a result, they had to essentially push the narrative that the deal, that the bombing was not only so successful that it eliminated the program, but it may actually have made diplomacy unnecessary. I think that was a threat to the Israelis. It told them Trump may just wash his hand of this entire issue, say no deal is any longer needed because there is no nuclear program, and just walk away from this. Because at the end of the day, as bad as I think it would be if we had that proliferation of nuclear weapons, this is not an immediate threat to the United States. It may be a threat to Israel, particularly mindful of how Israel is conducting itself, but it's not an immediate threat to the United States. So Trump was, I think, with that, sending a signal to the Israelis that they're going to have to join him in saying that this was successful, which incidentally they did. And after that, Trump also came out and defended Netanyahu in terms of his domestic judicial context in which the legal case is against him.
But I'm wondering whether or not this gives us an opportunity on something you've been working on for a long time, a real sea change in the possibility for Iran-U.S. relations. I want to just post a tweet that Donald Trump put out to the world. It's a very, very long tweet, but I'm going to read the highlighted part. He says, God bless Israel, God bless Iran, God bless the Middle East, God bless the United States of America, and God bless the world. And could you ever imagine a situation where the President of the United States wrote in a tweet, God bless Iran? Is this an opportunity for a real different track now in U.S.-Iran relations?
Precisely because of the fact that Trump can go out and say all kinds of things. The Iranians are not going to take that as seriously as they would if, for instance, Obama or Biden had said that. On the other hand, they would never have said that. I mean, Obama never tried his best to express positive sentiments vis-a-vis the Iranian people, as well as a pathway for the Iranians to get back into what he called the community of nations. Biden never said a positive word. Even when it came to him kind of getting back into diplomacy, he was not willing to lift a finger to create an atmosphere that would make diplomacy more likely. In fact, the first instance I see in which something positive was said about Iran, a positive message to the Iranian people, was when Iran qualified for the World Cup and Trump's envoy, Rob Malley, tweeted a congratulations to the Iranian people. That's it. Nothing else. Nothing that actually was in a systematic effort in order to actually pave the way to talks, which is what Obama did. He went out of his way. He had the Nowruz message, all of these different things to create an environment that was conducive to diplomacy. Trump, on the other hand, can say these things, but he can also bomb. So the spectrum has never been wider.
Do you think, Trita, that the war is over for Iran, from Iran's perspective, that we're not going to see retaliation down the road, that Iran may begin to change its rhetoric of anti-Israeli, anti-American focus, begin focusing more on its internal problems than its own people? Has anything changed in the DNA of Iran's direction or course, or are they just biding their time to wait for a moment to strike again?
If anything, it's gone in the wrong direction. After a country who doesn't have nuclear weapons has its nuclear program inspected by the IAEA, is engaged in diplomacy to agree to even further restrictions on its program, is attacked by two nuclear weapon states, who in turn had not been attacked by Iran, so there's no case to be made that this was self-defense. The idea that the desire for a nuclear deterrent would go down, I think, defies all logic. Instead, you're going to see the opposite. The desire for a nuclear deterrence is going to skyrocket. The balance within the Iranian regime, which had for the last 20 years and plus tilted in favor of those who said Iran should not get a nuclear weapon, but it should use the nuclear program as a bargaining chip in a negotiation with the West, which is exactly what happened in the JCPOA. It is now most likely tilted in the other direction, in which it is no longer just a bargaining chip, but actually a pathway to a nuclear deterrent. I find that highly problematic. I'm not saying that it cannot be reversed. I think it can, but it will require some very, very severe and deep engagement, and I think far more sanctions relief than Obama ever put on the table, which incidentally, Trump probably is inclined to offer. So I think there still is a pathway to such a deal, but we have to be honest that it's not only going to be more difficult because of the environment, but also because the desire on the Iranian side for a nuclear deterrence has skyrocketed.
Iran has the pathway to basically say, you know, throw the IAEA out and to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and voila, they're no longer bound by that social contract and the anti-proliferation regime, and then all of a sudden, Iran has a pathway that North Korea took and could very well take the North Korea route, get warheads, test them. Do you predict, given what you just shared, that that is likely to be the direction that Iran goes?
That is the more likely path. It can still be prevented, as I said. There is still an ability to be able to, through diplomacy, change Iran's calculations on this, but it's made it more difficult. If we only look at leverage and say, well, now they don't have a nuclear program, fine. Let's say that it was entirely destroyed. They can reconstitute that. Building those centrifuges, the centrifuges they have the capability of building now are actually more advanced than the ones that they were using. So I think the desire for a nuclear deterrent is far more important than the supply side. Do they have access to the material, etc., to build centrifuges? So in that sense, I think it's very, very bad. One of the first things I said after this bombing was that this is more or less ensured that Iran will be a nuclear weapon state 5 to 10 years from now. You had the European negotiator, Enrique Mora, who up until just a few months ago was the negotiator for the Europeans in this, say pretty much the same thing. That this June 21st is the day that the Iranian nuclear weapons program was born.
Do you believe that there's a new reality in the Middle East now that basically Israel and the United States are the might makes right powers in the region? Is there any sort of structure? Do the Abraham Accords matter anymore? I'm just sort of interested in this moment of identity in the region and whether or not the region just got a tough love lesson that no matter where it was, the aspirations of Saudi, of Qatar, of UAE, of other nations in the region finally are sort of shelved by whatever the United States and Israel determine. Israel a nuclear power in the region as well. Essentially, they are the ones that are going to set the terms in the region.
Let me put it this way. This did not create a Middle East or a world in which might makes right. This took away all pretense that it ever was anything different. I'm not saying that international law and such institutions at the UN do not matter. I think they matter tremendously. They matter in the manner in which they can restrict countries from going in that direction, change their incentives. But at the end of the day, when existential matters occur, then we always knew that no country would put international law above their own self-preservation. In this specific case, I think the primary things that have changed, first of all of those global South countries that didn't buy it when the West was talking about that we have to defend Ukraine because of the rules-based international order, feel very vindicated, because they realize that that was always a false argument. There was no such thing that the West, in that sense, really respected. And we've seen that clearly, exactly what I said earlier on about a non-nuclear power being attacked by two nuclear-equipped states. I think the primary thing that has changed now is that the Arab states, who for quite some time viewed Iran as a very dangerous threat, have now realized that the challenge from Iran will likely remain. It will, in some ways, potentially get worse, particularly if that scenario of them weaponizing materializes. But now I think they're far more concerned about Israel and about the United States. And they're concerned about Israel because they've seen that in the course of the last couple of years, the United States has more or less taken off all of the restrictions it used to put on Israel. They may not have been sufficient in many different ways, but we now see what Israel does when there are no restrictions on it. Compare how it's conducting itself in this war compared to 2006 in Lebanon, for instance. And that is because of what the Biden administration did in just taking all hands-off warrants. Secondly, you're now going to see a gravitation of a conflict between, or at least a deep rivalry between Israel and Turkey, given the constellational changes that are now taking place in the region. We've already seen that immediately after Turkey won in Syria, how the Israelis increasingly started to portray Turkey as a threat, putting pressure on the United States to do things against Turkey, which will be much, much more difficult than the manner in which they started that campaign in the early 1990s against Iran, after Iraq was defeated in the Persian Gulf War. Iran was already a non-friendly state, an enemy state. Turkey is a NATO member. So it's going to be much more complex than it was before. But that's where I think the core of the geopolitical rivalry in the Middle East is going to be shifting towards.
Let me ask you one question about how Iran is seeing its situation right now. To some degree, it saw its proxy, Hezbollah, become neutralized. It's seen the leadership of much of Hamas wiped out and even assassinated inside Iran. It saw its air defense system easily penetrated and neutralized. We now know that there are operating groups that Israel has access to or controls inside Iran. What do you think Iran has learned from this moment, given how porous and penetrable its security has been?
I think it means that the type of forward defense the Iranians have invested in for the last 15, 20 years is in shadows. The first line of defense of Hezbollah more or less is gone. Syria, of course, which was crucial in this. Hamas never played a big role in all of this. Their second line of defense for the air defenses, which was never something anyone particularly put much faith in, have proven to live up to the expectations, which is not much to have faith in. Their ability to strike back at Israel, however, I think has given them a lot of confidence. Over the course of these last 12 days, we saw how the Iranians started using new missiles, tested them. Some days they shot a lot of them, some days they shot fewer to test how they would work. They learned a lot about how the various levels of layers of Israeli air defense systems work. I think one of the last days of the fighting, they got more than 1/3 of the missiles through. They also saw how they could exhaust the Israeli air defense systems. I think one thing we have to really keep in mind, if this was an Iran-Israel fight, the outcome most likely would have been that the Iranians would have won. But it never was an Iran-Israel fight. The Israelis have superior military technology. Their intelligence services, as you point out, have scored some significant victories. And on that area, they're absolutely superior. But the reason why the Israelis nevertheless could fight in the manner they did is because of the constant support they were provided by the United States. This was an Israeli-American fight at the end of the day, since the U.S. is paying for 70% of Israel's military expenses. It is American weaponry with that is supplied to keep up their air defense system. It's the U.S. that is producing the Patriots, the Iron Dome, all of these. So in that sense, I think the Iranians also see that, yes, they are very vulnerable, and they're more vulnerable than they were before because of the successes with Israel. But also they have revealed and exploited and deepened many of Israel's own vulnerabilities. It's not entirely clear to me how the Israelis will be able to win that fight in the sense of producing even better air defense systems, while the Iranians are still not even halfway through what they can do on the missiles.
There's also other global stakeholders that are sitting on the sidelines watching what just happened, particularly Russia, particularly China. And I'm not sure they really stood up that strongly in Iran's defense. You may see it differently, but is Iran feeling like it has friends out there? Or were you as surprised as I was that essentially Iran was left on its own inside, Trump's machinations?
I think the Iranians were disappointed with Russia's conduct, and I hope that there would have been much stronger pressure from Russia for an end to this war, or perhaps some help. On the other hand, Russia's air defense systems had underperformed already in Ukraine, so I don't know how realistic it was for the Iranians to think that suddenly they would work so much better in Iran. But they probably wanted more from Russia. I don't think they had expectations from China. This is not how China does things. China does not step in this type of a manner. And I'm sure that if this had dragged on longer, they would likely have succeeded in getting some non-lethal military or other types of support for them, but nothing compared to what the United States, of course, is providing the Israelis. You also saw no statement coming out of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS, which was largely because the Indians were blocking it. So the picture is one in which Iran was more or less completely alone. And Israel was not having much support necessarily from elsewhere, but it had two things. He had massive support from the United States that kept on going, even at a moment when Trump was very upset with them. And secondly, a dramatic shift in Europe, in which they were no longer just justifying what Israel was doing. In the past they were opposing it, but it wasn't just that they were now justifying it, they were legitimizing it in the manner that the German chancellor said that Israel is doing our dirty work for us. That is a legitimization of what Israel was doing. They started off their statements by saying Israel has a right to defend itself, as if Israel had been attacked. You could have said that at least in the beginning of October 7th. They, of course, fired that statement a year and a half later, in which everything that happened apparently was justified by October 7th, but nothing justified October 7th. But now you had a situation, Iran had not even attacked them, and they were starting off their statements by saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. So in that sense, the strategic loneliness of Iran is another one of those factors that makes it very difficult to believe that absent some larger deal with some very, very significant incentives, the Iranians will not move towards weaponization.
Well, we will have to leave it there. Very grateful to you, Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what's the bottom line? In some ways, this 12-day war changes absolutely nothing in the equation between both sides, and Iran's sovereignty is still intact. But in other ways, the war has made a real difference. President Trump says Iran's nuclear program was so damaged, there's no need for further talks about that. And Israel was able to maneuver the U.S. after more than 30 years of trying into an overt and direct attack on Iran. But a lot of what we see now is the illusion of success. That illusion that Iran's nuclear program is over, or that illusion that Israel achieved a definitive military success against Iran, or Trump's illusion that this chapter is closed and needs no more attention, or the biggest illusion that Gaza and the Palestine question can be overlooked. Illusions are temporary, and the tensions in the Middle East are nowhere near resolved. And that's the bottom line.
My generation, as you know, tends to watch the mainstream news and the mainstream media. They don't delve too deeply. They're heavily invested in all of the pension funds. And so all of their thinking is tied to the assumption or the notion that, everything's going to be fine. Whatever happens, the government will intervene and make it right, and et cetera, et cetera. I think we're in different territory right now. And when you say what happened in the last 12 days, well, I think the Israelis, we're talking then about Mr. Netanyahu and his inner circle, were frustrated with the lack of progress in terms of dragging the United States into the war against Iran and decided to begin it on the assumption that three things would happen. First, that they would have the advantage of surprise. And indeed, President Trump and his cabinet, his envoys all contributed to that illusion. They helped with surprise. They helped to mislead the Iranians. So the Iranians, the Israelis assumed, would be very weak and completely off their game, if you will, because they weren't expecting to be attacked. Well, as it turns out, they recovered from the attack much, much more quickly than anybody believed. I certainly was shocked at how rapidly they regained control of their air defenses, how quickly they responded with counterattacks. And indeed, just a few days ago, Ben-Gvir, who is part of the Netanyahu inner circle, was caught saying to a group of Israelis and some Americans, well, we just underestimated the Iranian arsenal. We didn't realize that they had all these missiles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's happened is that what was supposed to be a knockout blow and leave Iran essentially naked in the face of Israeli military power backfired. And the Iranians did not only recover, they began launching huge quantities of missiles, doing enormous damage all over Israel. Now, people are giving various estimates, but a quick look at Haifa or a quick look at Tel Aviv, as well as a lot of military installations, tells the story. Israel has taken a lot of damage, and it has been unable to cope with it. So then they reached a point where it became clear that they desperately needed some interruption in this. Something had to stop because they're running out of missiles of their own. In other words, we can't produce air defense missiles quickly enough to meet the Israeli demand. And just today, Raytheon published some statements about the lack of rocket motors. We don't even build our own rocket motors inside the United States anymore. So you can imagine if we're not building our own rocket motors and we need components from overseas, well, we're in a lot of trouble. So we can't replenish all the missiles that we've shot, as well as the Israelis. And we've shot hundreds from our destroyers offshore, as well as from the Theater High Altitude Air Defense Battery that's on the ground in Israel, and so forth. So then I think there was a discussion, well, how do we disrupt this? And you got this strike by President Trump. I think President Trump was trying to sort through what he ought to do, what he ought not to do. He was listening to lots of people. Remember, he said, I'm going to take 2 weeks and think about this or something. Then a couple of days later, bang, you get the strike. Well, he consulted with people, and they said, this will be really good if you do this. This could bring everything to a halt, and, this would be good for Israel and the United States, and ultimately, that's what we want. And so I think he bought the argument. I think he was also concerned because a lot of people told him the Iranians can close the Straits of Hormuz. And normally we think of, they'll sink a ship there, well, they can do those things. But to be quite frank, if the Iranians tell anybody that wants to go through the straits, they can't go through. And if they do go through, they risk being sunk. The insurance companies will shut down the Straits of Hormuz because they won't insure the vessels. So I think all of that was swimming around, and the impact of this loss of, say, 20-25% of the world's oil would not be acutely felt immediately here, but certainly around the world. And I think he understood that had implications for China, implications for Russia, for the whole world. And I think then he decided, well, I've got to do something else. Now, we've seen this strike that was launched, and he's been on the television all day long promoting this narrative that we found these installations, we've destroyed all the nuclear capability, it's over. We'd set Iran back for years. Well, the truth is something different. We seem to have hit sites that were empty. There were no nuclear development facilities there. People were removed. The Iranians were warned 2 hours in advance, and the Iranians actually accommodated us. We came in and dropped munitions on empty targets. Then subsequently the next day, the Iranians informed us that they were going to hit our installation air base in Bahrain, and they knew that we'd already evacuated everyone from Bahrain. So that was an ideal target. They told us they were coming, they bombed it, they destroyed it. In other words, I think you have a situation where, truthfully, neither Iran nor the United States want to go to war with each other. And so he knew that if he did something, that was better than nothing, but he didn't want to do anything that would widen the war. So now he's telling everybody, well, the war's over. There will be no more war. It stopped. And it stopped because I'm the great peacemaker. I'm master of the universe. I control everything. I stopped the Indo-Pakistani war. I stopped all these other things. And now I've stopped this. Both sides are exhausted. They can't continue and so forth. Well, that's not really true. And that's a dangerous thing for him to say. So at this point, I don't have any more to tell you except that more to follow.
Well, a lot of this feels like political theater. And to your point, we're being led to believe that this was a very successful strike. These were very key nuclear sites. We destroyed them. We destroyed Iran's ability to have a nuclear weapon. And I think that that's part of what gets so confusing. By the way, off the top of your response, you mentioned Nassim and his book, Black Swan, has spiked in sales just in the last couple of days because everyone is expecting maybe a Black Swan scenario, World War III to start. And the last time you and I spoke, you actually forecast that we might get into a hot war with Iran. So it seems like some of this is playing out. But right now, to your point, President Trump is saying it's all over. He dropped the bombs, then he dropped an F-bomb when he was questioned by reporters.
We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. Do you understand that?
And now things seem to be de-escalated, but you're saying maybe that's not the case and things could erupt again? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, what we have is a ceasefire. That means the two sides have agreed not to shoot at each other. The first, of course, being the first, of course, being the Israelis who said we won't shoot. Now, what does that mean? What is the basis for the ceasefire? What is the long-term goal that the ceasefire is supposed to achieve? What are we doing to facilitate some sort of agreement, understanding that will prevent any further killing in the region? Do you know? I don't know. As far as I can tell, there's nothing. And so what we have is a ceasefire during which I fully expect the Israelis will do everything in their power to get as many missiles, as many weapons as they can, repair radars, repair everything to get ready for the next round. In other words, I don't see any evidence that the Israelis are dancing in the streets saying the war is over, we've won, we can relax. No, quite the contrary. I think Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and so forth are all going to be very, very busy now trying to produce more missiles to get them back up to speed for the next round of attacks. And I think in Iran, the Iranians are happy because they don't want to be bombed. But on the other hand, they're well aware that what they've done is actually quite an achievement. They've overwhelmed Israeli defenses. You know, any air defense system can be overwhelmed. It's just a matter of numbers and time. During World War II, we lost 18,000 bombers, we and the Royal Air Force, trying to penetrate German air defenses. And German air defenses at the time were state-of-the-art. They were excellent. But ultimately, we won because we could produce more bombers faster and send more of them through the air defenses than the Germans could produce pilots, aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, and so forth.
I want to move on to the big, beautiful bill, and you have asked to have this on your desk by July 4th. You think you're going to get it in that timing?
I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you that. I hate to say yes. I'd like to say yes, but the problem is if we're 2 days late or 5 days late, everybody says, oh, you had a tremendous failure. Whatever it is, as long as we have it, it's very important. If we don't have it, there's a 68% tax increase. If we don't have it, you know, the debt ceiling extension is very important. They gave a debt ceiling, the Republicans gave a debt ceiling because of the importance of doing it. They did that for the good of the country, and Republicans voted for that. They did a big favor. I don't know that I would have done it, to be honest with you, but whatever. They did a favor. Now the Democrats won't do that favor back. In other words, you never want to violate your debt covenants. So they gave, you know what I'm saying, they gave this 4 months early. It was due on September 28th, right before the election. A group of Republicans got together and said, you know what, this is so serious. We should do this for the good of the country. I understand that. Now it's their turn to do it, and they won't do it. There are a lot of bad people in the Democrat Party.
How are you going to deal with the $9 trillion that's coming due this year?
Just turn it over. Oh, well, let me tell you that we're going to do it this way. We're going to turn it over short term because we have a stupid person at the Fed. If he would lower the rates, but I don't want to pay for 10 years debt at a higher rate. And then when you get somebody into the Fed who's going to be able to lower the rates, we should be at 1% or 2%. You know, if you look at Switzerland, they're the lowest right now. They're at much less than 1 point. And frankly, we should be there too, because without the United States, the whole world doesn't work.
And you teased a couple of names. You said you have a couple of people in mind
I have
as a
three.
successor to Jay Powell.
They'll all be good, yeah.
But you're not going to do that right now. So why do that? Just to put more pressure on him to come in?
People that know, because reporters ask me, I mean, you have other names? I say, yeah, I do. Anybody but Powell.
And would it be Kevin?
Well, he's a bad person. Yeah. Kevin is very talented, but I don't know if it's going to be him, but he's a very talented guy. He wouldn't be doing what Powell is.
Mr. President, I think I know your priorities in the big, beautiful bill. I mean, obviously, you want to get the tax cuts extended, and you've got other tax cuts.
Many other things, though, takes care of the border. There's also no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime.
But I've spoken to a few senators, and they've gotten together, like Rick Scott and Ron Johnson and Mike Lee. And, you know, Rick Scott's worried about the overall cost, and Mike Lee's worried about the Inflation Reduction Act. And, you know,
the Inflation Reduction Act is what caused a lot of problems.
so why don't you just take that out
It
of
was
the
the
bill?
Biden administration.
Why are there still green subsidies in that?
I'm all for that. I think we shouldn't be giving money to all of these scams. But what happened is some of them have been started, like projects, and if you stop it, it's in the middle. So I understand that too, and people work there, and they're, you know, working there, and they're from the district of a congressman or a senator. But no. The Inflation Reduction Act was another Biden scam. And when I say Biden, it's not Biden. It was the lunatics that work around the, you know, in the Oval Office, around the beautiful Resolute desk. It's not Biden, because I don't think Biden knew what was happening. I think that the auto pen is one of the biggest scandals in the history of this country, because the person that operated the auto pen was the President of the United States, and I think that that's going to be sought out, and we're going to find out what happened.
Well, I believe it's this week that's 1 year ago, which was the debate where his mental capacity was exposed to so many people who didn't know it. Many of us saw it, obviously, in advance. And now James Comer at the Oversight Committee wants lots of people to come in. Who would you like to see come in and testify on that? Under oath.
I would say Lisa, who was in there.
Is that the deputy AG at the time?
Yeah, who's
Lisa Monaco.
who's a big supporter of Andrew Weissman. These are people that I think are very bad people. They had radical left lunatics working there, and they took over that office. They didn't Biden, and then after a little while they realized he's incompetent. This is really a good thing, and they ran that thing. Look, Biden was never for open borders. Biden was never for transgender for everybody. He was never for men playing in women's sports. He was never for that. Biden is a disaster. This is a disaster. But the worst thing that he's done to us, inflation is terrible, but I've solved that problem already. Inflation is bad, and other things are bad, and many things are, and the fact that we have no respect all around the world for the country, but now we do at I think maybe at the high, we took it from the lowest to the highest level in 6 months. But if you look at what he did to the border, is so bad. So much of my time is spent on the border. You know, last month we had no people coming.
I know. Well, when you get...
But the bad part is he let in 21 million people. And we have to check those people. Totally unvetted, totally unchecked. And 11,888 have murdered people. Half of them have murdered more than one person. People come in from gangs, from prisons. They emptied out Venezuela, emptied out its prisons.
Have you been backing away from this, though? Because recently you said, let's ease up on, you know, taking in people who are working, hardworking, like in farms and hotels.
I don't back away. What I do have, I cherish our farmers. And when we go into a farm and we take away people that have been working there for 15 and 20 years, who are good, who possibly came in incorrectly, and what we're going to do is we're going to do something for farmers where we can let the farmer sort of be in charge. The farmer knows he's not going to hire a murderer. But, you know, when you go into a farm and he's had somebody working with him for 9 years doing this kind of work, which is hard work to do, and a lot of people aren't going to do it, and you end up destroying a farmer because you took all the people away, it's a problem. You know, I'm on both sides of the thing. I'm the strongest immigration guy that there's ever been, but I'm also the strongest farmer guy that there's ever been. And that includes also hotels and, you know, places where people work, a certain group of people work. So we're working on it right now. We're going to work it so that some kind of a temporary pass where people pay taxes, where the farmer can have a little control as opposed to you walk in and take everybody away. But no, the criminals are going out of this country.
Right, you said it from the beginning. You wanted to first focus on the criminals, but I'm wondering if this change in giving people a pass is a response to the critics who said the execution was a little clumsy. People were afraid to go to work. They were afraid to run into ICE. They said, you know, look, if you give a quota to somebody and say, go get me 600 people who are here in the country illegally, we'll come back with 600 people, even if it's not the right 600.
So the execution was unbelievable because you have no people coming through our border anymore. That's part of the execution. So it wasn't clumsy. What was clumsy is the fact that they allowed millions and millions of people to pour into our country. Take a look at some of the scenes. It's on your show all the time, where thousands of people are trying to bust through a wall. They literally break down walls. There's so many people, and they're thousands of people, and they have no idea who those people are. This, to me, is the worst part of Biden. The worst thing he did was the whole thing on immigration. Now, with that being said, we know who they are, a lot of them. You know, it's hard. When they come in, they have no papers, they have no nothing. Just go ahead in. Everybody can come in. They were empty. I'm telling you, a lot of the Congo, we just made a deal with the Congo to stop the war. They would empty their prisons into the United States. Many other countries, not just South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, rough parts of Europe, their prisons were emptied into the United States, and the people, you saw the people, they run into the country. To me, that's a sin that we can never forget. We can never forget what Biden and that group of lunatics that work for him have done to our country.
I believe that half of the world's cobalt is in the Congo.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to help develop that? Will the U.S. participate in developing that cobalt?
Yeah, they want me to. They actually want me to. The head, who's a very respected guy, you know, look, we just stopped the war. This war's been 30 years. 6 million people were killed between Congo and Rwanda. And my people came to me, they say, they want you, they don't want China, they don't want Russia.
Hey, it's Will Kane. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our...
Now, regarding the big, beautiful bill, and I'll tell you why that's good news for you, but let me take a little bit of time to talk about current policy versus current law. I know everybody's on the edge of their seat at home, but here's what I would tell you about numbers and budget chairmen. I'm not the first budget chairman. There have been those who came before me. In 2008, Chairman Kent Conrad, a really nice guy from North Dakota, used a new baseline in the budget so he could get the farm bill in the budget. And Judd Gregg, really smart guy, former budget chairman, said the chairman of the budget committee declared the new baseline under a new budget. The budget chairman has a right to do that. That's what I'm doing. I'm setting the numbers. The parliamentarian said, that's my job as budget chairman. The resolution we're operating under to get us here, we voted to make that the case. So we're not doing anything sneaky. We actually voted to give me the authority to do this, and it passed. But again, I'm not the first chairman to change a baseline for different reasons. One, to get the farm bill in, and another occasion, Senator Sanders changed the baseline in 2022 when he was budget chairman under budget reconciliation to issue a budget rule allowing the numbers to change to get more money for Head Start. So Senator Sanders, as budget chairman, directed a new rule be written to get more money for Head Start. So don't tell me you've never done this before in terms of changing the baseline as budget chairman. The budget chairman under 312 sets the baseline. This has been acknowledged by Republicans and Democrats. The baseline has changed in the past based on the budget committee chairman's desire, one to get a farm bill in, and the other to change the numbers, a new rule to get Head Start spending. So this has been done before, but I'll be the first to say that what we're doing here is historic in a good way. In 2017, we passed the Trump tax cuts. They're due to expire in December. Why is that? Before I got here, current law was the way to score or implement tax policy. After 10 years, the tax cuts expired, current law. As budget chairman, I've decided to use current policy when it comes to cutting taxes. If you use current policy, they never expire, so the policies that were created in 2017 would not end in December, they would continue, and that's a good thing for the American people, that's a good thing for the economy, because it gives you certainty. So I made a decision as budget chairman, working with my colleagues, to look at tax cuts, something important for the country, to give certainty to businesses and individuals, and make sure after 10 years they don't arbitrarily go away and have a cliff. So I made that decision, my colleagues backed me up, and that's in the budget resolution governing the debate that we're here today. So why do we want to make the tax cuts permanent? Because if they expire in December, the average family of four in South Carolina will have a $1,700 increase. I don't want that, and I bet you people at home don't want that. So we have to deal with that. That cliff is coming, and not only do I want to avoid that cliff, I don't want to put us in that position ever again. So the tax cuts have generated more revenue for the government than CBO estimated in 2017. The one thing about our friends at CBO, I appreciate all your hard work, you worked really hard. When it comes to taxing, they always get it wrong about how much revenue to be collected. So when you look at the years that have passed since 2017, on the corporate side, on the individual side, the revenue to the government has actually grown because of those tax cuts, and that's a good thing. So cutting taxes means more money for you and your family. Our friends on the other side, if you're waiting on them to cut your taxes, you're going to die waiting. So they're never going to do it. Why are we doing it? Because they won't do it. We could never get 60 votes for this. So the bottom line is we're going to make these tax cuts permanent, and that's a good thing for businesses. Expensing will be allowed so you can invest and grow your business. You can buy new equipment. You can write it off sooner, and that will get more activity in the economy. It's not me saying that. There's a track record, Mr. President. You've been in business. This stuff works. They don't like it, but it works. If you're in business and the tax code encourages you to invest in your business, you will. This stuff literally works. And they hate it because it's money that could have gone to the government went back into the economy. What they don't realize, actually, the government gets more money. They just keep spending it. And we could do better on the spending side. And we are going to do better on the spending side. So this bill makes the 2017 tax cuts permanent. It avoids a tax increase for your family that's coming in December if we don't act now. It secures the border. One of the reasons there are more of us than our Democratic friends is how you screwed the country up for the last 4 years. We went from secure borders to completely open borders, absolute chaos, and that's why we're winning and you're losing. And you want to take us back to open borders. We're not going. We're not going back to your policies that allowed 8.3 million encounters at the border, 1.7 million gotaways, chaos, the cities and communities. We're not going back to the policies that led to Laken Riley's murder in Georgia, where the man convicted for murdering her was captured several times, released because there was no detention space to hold him in Texas, and he left a free man, went to Georgia and killed this lady. That's happened too many times, and it's going to stop. Now, what are we doing to secure the border? We went from lawless borders to the most secure borders in 6 months because of President Trump. President Trump, you should be exceedingly proud. Holman, the whole team, you've locked that border down, but we want to do it in a way that it'll stay locked down for the president after you and beyond. So how do we secure the gains made by President Trump and his team? We're going to, in this bill, hire more ICE agents to expedite removal of people that shouldn't be here, particularly criminal elements, people that are dangerous. We're going to finish the wall. Now, one Democrat, maybe one, no way would get 60 votes to hire more ICE agents. No way we would get Democratic help to finish the wall. And we're going to go from 40,000 detention beds to 125,000. This secure the border is about $175 billion. New technology along the border, fiber cable, so we don't go back to the days of open borders. This is in the bill. To those of you who voted for us and President Trump to secure the border, we're delivering through this bill. And they would never do what we're doing. I'll be the first to admit, when it comes to securing the border, they're never going to do what we're doing. We're hiring more ICE agents, we're finishing the wall, and we're increasing more detention beds so we don't let people out that can go and murder. I'm very proud of this. I wrote this part. This is money well spent. This will secure that border in perpetuity. President Trump, this is your plan. It is in our bill. Well done. To my friends on the other side, you had your chance and you screwed it up big time. And that's why we're in charge. Revitalize our military. The world is a dangerous place. We have $150 billion in this bill to help build out the Golden Dome, to help improve the quality of life of men and women serving in the military by improving their barracks and housing. They need the money, more weapons. It's in this bill, and we didn't have to get extorted to buy a bunch of butter to get $150 billion. We reduced government spending over a decade by $1.6 trillion. We're running deficits, national debt of $37 trillion. So what have we done here? In the last 5 years, from 2020 basically to now, Medicaid has grown by 50%. So what's happened is that Medicaid was originally intended for children and poor families, children and people who were disabled and couldn't work to provide health care. Count me in for that, makes a lot of sense. Along comes President Obama. He expands Medicaid to include able-bodied adults for the first time. And what he did was he incentivized states to include these people in Medicaid. For every new able-bodied adult, you get 90% of the cost from the federal government, 10% from the states. And Medicaid has grown 50%, is going to take over Medicare because of what President Obama did. So what are we going to do? We're going to try to deal with that in a responsible way. What about this idea? If you're not a child, if you're not disabled, you're able-bodied, and you don't have any children under 14, we're going to have a 20-hour-a-week work requirement for you to stay on Medicaid. That's a good thing. It's a good thing for the individual involved to be working. It's a good thing for the taxpayer for them to be working. But that seems to be a crime on the other side, to ask somebody to work that can work. How many people out there are listening to this? I don't know how many you are, but are you working every day? Are you going to work with kids? A lot of people do that, by the way. So one of the reforms in this bill is to introduce a work requirement to the additional population that President Obama put on Medicaid that was never intended on the original purpose of Medicaid. This work requirement is going to save a bunch of money. Finally, we're addressing the biggest scam I've seen in a very long time. Somewhere along the line, somebody figured out that at the state level, that if you tax doctors and hospitals and medical providers on the funds they get and take that revenue, you can actually get more Medicaid money. This is a money laundering scheme. It needs to come to an end as we know it. States have gone up to 6% of a provider tax. They take that tax revenue and they use it to get more money from the federal government. The hospitals and doctors don't lose, they get the money back. The state doesn't lose, they get more money. The only group that loses is the federal government, and we're deep, deep in debt. So we're going to reform the provider tax system that I think is abusive, very abusive. As to Medicaid, it's on a growth trajectory that will overtake Medicare. Now is the time to put common sense reform in place, not only to slow the growth, and we're not talking about cutting Medicaid, we're slowing the growth, but try to create some sense of fiscal responsibility. So, to our chairman of the Finance Committee, you have constructed a package better than 2017. You have included some growth elements in the package that will allow the economy to grow because it will be in businesses' interest to invest. And I want to applaud you for this growth package. Now, what does this all mean? Current policy, current law. If you do what I have decided to do, make the tax cuts permanent, and you implement these reforms to Medicaid in other areas, you will, over the next 10 years, reduce the deficit by $507 billion. That's CBO, not me. Now, how do you do that? You grow the economy, and you begin to control spending in a common sense way. Most people can relate to that because they do it all the time. People at home sometimes have to work extra to meet the needs of their family, and they have to tighten their belt. So what have we achieved here in the one big beautiful bill? We're going to make your border as secure as it possibly can be and never go back to open borders. We're going to put in place border security measures that keep it secure. We're going to make the tax cuts permanent so your taxes do not go up in December of this year, and we're going to add additional pro-growth policies to help our economy. We're going to reform Medicaid in a way that makes sense, deal with the waste, fraud, and abuse of that program so that there's more money for the disabled and children, because the more money you give the able-bodied who can work, it's less money for children and people on disability. And one of the most perverse things about what President Obama did is that the reimbursement rates to states are higher for able-bodied adults than they are for disabled people and children. 90%. So President Obama created a system to entice states, lure them in to add people to Medicaid that are not disabled, not poor children, because his goal was to put everybody in the country under government-run health care, and the government reimbursement is higher for an able-bodied person than it is for a poor child or a disabled person, and we're going to stop that, because that's not fair. It's not fair to the taxpayer, and it's not fair to the population that we're trying to help. So we're going to control spending in a common sense way. We're going to revitalize our military at a time of great need. We're going to secure the border, and we're going to make the tax cuts that expire in December permanent, so we don't have to deal with this every 10 years. It's a big, beautiful bill if you believe in cutting taxes, securing the border, having a strong military, and controlling government spending. It is a nightmare, this bill, for those who want to raise taxes, who want open borders, who want a weak military, and never want to control one dime of federal spending. This bill is your nightmare if you're for open borders. This bill is your nightmare if you want the government to grow without any limitation. This bill is your nightmare if you want a weak military, because it's going to give us a stronger military. So why do we have this debate? That's what they, through years of effort, have done. The military is always the last thing that gets funded when they're in charge. When they're in charge, have the border completely broken, millions of people running through our country lawless. When they're in charge, there is no limit to growing the government. They entice everybody to grow the government. And when they're in charge, they're never going to cut your taxes in any meaningful way. The tax rates since 2017, the top rate has been 37. If these tax cuts expire, your taxes, if you're a family of four, will go up by $1,700. And we'll go back to the 39.6 rate. Here's a question for the country. How much should the federal government take of anybody's income? What's a fair share? 37% seems pretty damn fair to me. Over a third of what you make, and that doesn't count state and local taxes. The number they would pick is probably a 90. So is 37% fair? I think yes. Most Americans think 25% is fair. You know, Jesus wants 10%. There is no number they won't embrace. So somewhere between 90 and 10, 37 is fair. This is not rewarding the wealthy, it's creating a number that makes sense. 37% going to the federal government is a fair share. It's over a third of what you make. And that doesn't count state and local taxes. This has been long and hard, but we're about done. In a couple of days, we're going to pass the One Big Beautiful Bill. The staff deserve at least one day off. Enough for what you and your team have done. To my budgeteers, you have been terrific. You've worked really hard. To CBO and George